He lived alone, drove trucks, fixed things, and never talked much. No one knew he once served, no one asked. The world, Hank Monroe was just another quiet old man on the road. But one night, on a frozen highway, in a storm that could kill, he made a choice most would ignore. He stepped out into the cold for a stranger. What he didn't know was that this man wasn't just anyone, and that by morning, the Navy would be on his doorstep. Not for punishment, but for gratitude. This isn't a story about medals. It's about honor and what happens when kindness meets the right moment. Here's how one quiet decision changed everything. Hank Monroe wasn't the kind of man people noticed. At 61, he was just another long-haul trucker out of suburban Pennsylvania, one of thousands who moved unseen beneath the pulse of America's highways. No one followed his life on social media. Few knew he had once worn the uniform of a U.S. Marine, and if they asked, he'd shrug it off with a half smile, as if that chapter belonged to someone else. His face carried the map of time, weather-worn skin, crow's feet deepened by sun and solitude, and hands like sandpaper that gripped the wheel for hundreds of thousands of miles. But what set him apart most was the slight limp in his right leg, a quiet reminder of a supply route accident back in 2004 during a routine mission in muddy terrain. Nobody died, but his knee never quite healed right. When Hank left the Corps, he didn't look for glory or comfort. He chose the road, steady, predictable, distant. Long-haul trucking became his life's rhythm. Drive, deliver, return, repair something in the garage, and sip black coffee alone at dawn in highway rest stops where no one asked questions. His home, a tired two-bedroom built in the 70s, had creaky floorboards, a furnace that moaned each winter, and a porch that leaned like a weary soldier. Still, Hank never complained. He fixed what broke, never asked for help, and never expected any in return. His neighbors called him that vet with the tools, always ready to lend, rarely ready to talk. One December evening, standing on that sagging porch, Hank watched the first flurries of snow drift beneath the dull amber of the streetlight. The weather report warned of a blizzard. Most folks were hunkering down, but Hank had promised a shipment to Maple Creek by morning, and a promise, even to a faceless logistics company, was still sacred. He didn't think of life in metaphors, he didn't believe in fate, he believed in keeping wheels turning. But in less than 12 hours, that steady rhythm, the one that shielded him from the chaos of the world, would be broken. And a quiet decision made in the freezing dark would echo louder than he ever imagined. By nightfall, the sky had turned to steel. Snow came fast and heavy like ash from a silent volcano, flurries thickening into sheets, swallowing the road in slow white death. Hank's rig moved cautiously along Route 87, headlights bouncing off the blinding curtain of flakes. Freight needed to reach Maple Creek by dawn, and while most trucks pulled into rest stops to wait out the storm, Hank kept rolling. Promises mattered, but promises didn't stop the storm. By midnight, the road ahead was closed. State troopers had radioed warnings. Jackknife rigs and buried sedans littered the shoulders. Hank eased his truck into a staggered line of stranded haulers along a desolate stretch of highway just past mile marker 242. The engine idled, a low hum keeping the cabin warm while the rest of the world froze over. Inside it was quiet, just the low whir of the heater and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. Other drivers chimed in, voices soaked in frustration, fatigue, and fear. "Looks like we're stuck till morning," one grumbled. "Whiteout up ahead, don't even try it," another warned. Then came a different voice, crackling, hesitant. "There's someone out there, standing by the road. Old man, maybe? Just standing there in the snow." Silence. Then a sharper voice snapped back, "Leave him, ain't our problem. This ain't the time for heroics." That made Hank sit up straighter. He leaned toward his windshield, eyes squinting through frost. There, barely visible in the swirling white, was a figure. bent, barely moving, a silhouette wrapped in what looked like a thin coat, hunched against the storm, not waving, not walking, just standing. 15 degrees below zero. A man couldn't last long out there. Hank's fingers hovered above the heater dial, the warmth soaking into his bones. He looked down at his leg. It had been stiff all evening. Cold made it worse. He thought of the risks, the pain, the logic. Let someone else handle it. Someone younger, stronger. But logic had never saved a life. Reflex had. Instinct had. And somewhere deep in that instinct was a voice from long ago, gravelly and calm, his old gunnery sergeant who once said, "You don't leave anyone behind. Ever. I don't care if they're a soldier or a stranger." Without another word, Hank zipped up his heavy coat, pulled on his wool cap, and opened the door. The wind howled like a living thing, slapping his face raw the moment he stepped down. Snow bit into his neck and clawed at his knees. Every step through the drift was like moving through wet cement. His legs screamed, but "Sir?" he called out, voice nearly lost in the storm. The figure turned slightly, his face pale, lips tinted blue. No answer, just a faint nod, like the last breath of a flame about to vanish. "Come with me," Hank said, already gripping the man's arm. The skin beneath the coat was alarmingly cold. Hank tightened his grip, throwing the stranger's weight over his shoulder. The return trek was slower, more brutal. The wind pushed them sideways and snow dragged them downward, but Hank focused only on the dim orange glow of his cab light. His lighthouse in a frozen sea. They reached the truck. Hank flung open the door, helped the man inside, and slammed it shut. The warmth inside felt like a miracle. He wrapped the stranger in an emergency blanket, poured hot coffee into a steel mug, and pressed it into his shaking hands. Without asking questions, he adjusted the vents, shut the windows, and made the small space as safe and silent as possible. The man tried to speak, nothing but a rasp. "Rest," Hank said softly. "When morning comes, I'll figure out how to get you where you need to go." Outside, the storm howled in protest, but inside that cabin a small peace had formed, fragile but real. The CB crackled again, voices scoffing, dismissing, doubting. But Hank wasn't listening anymore. He leaned back in his seat, the stranger beside him wrapped in borrowed warmth, and whispered under his breath like a prayer not meant for God, "No one freezes tonight, not on my watch." The storm roared on through the night, a wild, relentless thing, slamming against the truck like it had a grudge. But inside the cab, time seemed to pause. The stranger had collapsed into a deep, shivering sleep, his breath fogging the inside of the windshield. Hank sat beside him, arms crossed, eyes heavy but alert, stealing glances every so often to make sure the man was still breathing. He didn't ask questions. Years in the Marines had taught him that sometimes silence was the greatest act of kindness you could offer. The man stood once, coughing so hard it shook his entire frame. Hank leaned forward, quietly offering a sip of water, and the man nodded in thanks without words. Outside, plows groaned past in the distance, their flashing lights throwing ghostly shadows across the snow-covered world. The CB occasionally crackled with updates, complaints, and the usual banter of restless truckers, but Hank ignored it all. Morning came slowly, the light breaking through a veil of snow like the first breath after drowning. The worst of the blizzard had passed, but the world outside remained a frozen wasteland. Inside, the man finally stirred. He sat up, blinking in confusion at first, then looking around the cab as if grounding himself in reality. His eyes, though rimmed with exhaustion, were sharp, calculated, intelligent. Then, in a voice rasped raw from cold and fatigue, he spoke. "Thank you." Hank gave a simple nod. "Glad you're still with us. Once the plows make a clear path, I can get you to the next town." "Appreciated," the man replied, clearing his throat. "Is there a phone? I may need to contact someone." Hank tilted his head. "Family?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat with careful precision. His hands still shook slightly from the cold, but his movements were practiced, decisive. From the inner lining, he pulled a small, weathered metal card. Its edges were worn and the surface scratched from years of use, but the lettering was still clear. M. Nicholas, T. Grave, U.S. Navy. Hank's breath caught. A second passed, then another. His spine straightened, not in showy deference, but instinctively, like something in his bones remembered how to stand when rank entered the room. He didn't salute, he didn't have to, but respect rolled off him like heat from the engine. "You're an admiral," he said quietly. Graves nodded, as if being rescued by a trucker in a snowstorm was the most routine thing in the world. "I was headed to a memorial service," he said, voice regaining some strength. "Old comrade. Died last year. My driver took ill at the last stop. I thought I could make the last stretch alone. GPS failed. Then I hit the ice. The car's somewhere back there." He motioned vaguely toward the storm-covered road. "Tried walking the last few miles." "How long were you out there?" Hank asked. "Couple hours, maybe." Graves gave a ghost of a grin. "Felt like longer." Hank said nothing for a long moment. The military part of him, the one that had spent 2 decades moving people and supplies across war zones, calculated what that meant. 2 hours in sub-zero temperatures and nothing but a light coat. The man had no right to still be breathing. "Any rank deserves respect, sir," Hank said finally, "but I'm just logistics corps, Marines, nothing fancy." Graves looked at him carefully, his gaze both steady and knowing. "And I was just a frozen old man last night," he replied, "Corporal Monroe." "Hank Monroe, right?" Hank blinked. "Yes, sir, retired 2004. Graves nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Corporal Monroe, I've learned over the years that the most important chain of command is sometimes just human being to human being." He looked out the window then, toward the pale, still world beyond the frosted glass. "And I appreciate your discretion," he added, quieter now. "Not all would recognize that sometimes an admiral prefers not to call in the cavalry when he's made a personal mistake." Hank poured the man another cup of coffee and passed it to him without a word. "I understand, sir," he said. "Nobody deserves to freeze to death trying to honor someone who's fallen." Graves wrapped his cold hands around the cup, eyes flicking up to meet Hank's. "I won't forget this," he said. "I remember clearly the name of the man who saved my life." There was something in his voice, an edge of promise, of something unspoken, but real. The heater continued to hum. Outside, the road was slowly being carved back into visibility. Inside, something else, less visible but just as enduring, had begun to thaw. When the snowplows finally pushed through and a convoy of blinking lights cleared a narrow path along the highway, Hank eased the rig back onto the road, careful not to jolt the man in the passenger seat. The Admiral sat quietly, wrapped in borrowed warmth, eyes gazing out the side window as if memorizing the world all over again. Neither spoke much. There are silences between men who've seen too much, not empty ones, but full of things they've chosen not to say, and Hank had long ago learned that respect didn't always wear a uniform or raise its voice. They reached the next town just after 9 a.m. The local police station, a squat brick building with frost curling around its windows, looked almost too small for a man of Admiral Graves' stature. But when Hank parked the truck and helped him down, there were no fanfares, no reporters, no military salutes, only the slight stiffness in the Admiral's joints and the soft crunch of boots on ice. The officers were stunned. One of them stammered when he saw the ID. Another ran to call the chief. Within minutes, a private room was arranged and a secure line opened. The Admiral declined medical attention. "Navy men don't catch colds," he joked with a thin smile, brushing aside Hank's concern. "But I do need to reach my security detail." Before disappearing into the back office, Graves turned to Hank one last time. He extended his hand, not like an admiral, but like a man who knew what it meant to owe something beyond rank or regulation. "Thank you," he said simply. Hank took the handshake, firm and steady. "No need, sir, you take care." And just like that, it was over. No photos, no medals, no names were exchanged beyond what necessity required. Hank didn't wait around to see what happened next. He had a delivery to finish, already hours behind schedule. He climbed back into his truck, adjusted the seat, and turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life, dependable and unceremonious, just like him. By evening, the cargo was offloaded in Maple Creek. He washed down the rig at a rest stop outside town, wiped the salt and slush from the chrome, and began the long drive home. When he finally pulled into his driveway just after dark, the house greeted him like always. Quiet, cold, waiting. He parked the truck, stepped inside, and flipped on the kitchen light. It buzzed like it always did. The floor creaked beneath his boots. The radiator coughed once and resumed its low groan. Outside, the snow had settled into thick, clean drifts. Inside, everything looked the same. And yet, something felt different. The encounter with the Admiral became just another story Hank never told anyone. He didn't write about it, didn't post a photo, didn't bring it up over coffee at the truck stop, or mention it when folks asked how the storm went. He had done what needed doing, that was all. And in Hank Monroe's world, that was always enough. 3 weeks passed. Winter deepened. The snow didn't stop, it just learned to sit still, blanketing roofs and driveways, pressing silence into every corner of the neighborhood. Hank spent his off days the way he always had, working on the porch, one board at a time. The railing had taken a beating over the years. Rot had crept into the wood like time itself, quiet, patient, inevitable. He never complained. That Tuesday morning, the sky was pale and brittle. Frost clung to the grass like tiny shards of glass, and the world felt wrapped in a hush. Hank knelt by the last length of the railing, a can of white paint beside him. His brush moved slowly, deliberately, as if honoring each nail, each grain of old wood. The porch creaked beneath him, groaning. Then came the engines. First one, then another, then 6. Their low growls broke the morning stillness like thunder through the snow. Hank paused, straightened up slowly, and turned. Military jeeps, dark, polished, precise, rolled into the street in single file. Each bore the Navy insignia, stark against the winter gray. They stopped cleanly in front of his house, forming a tight line along the curb like a formation on a parade ground. Across the street, curtains rustled. Mrs. Donovan, who'd lived opposite Hank for nearly 3 decades and had barely spoken 10 words to him in the last 5 years, stepped out onto her porch with a steaming mug of coffee in hand, not even pretending not to stare. The lead Jeep door opened. A young officer in a full-dress uniform stepped out, his boots crunching lightly on the snow. His posture was textbook perfect. Back straight, eyes level, movements crisp. He walked up to Hank's gate and called out clearly, his voice calm and formal. "Excuse me, sir, is this the residence of Mr. Henry Monroe?" Hank set his paintbrush down slowly and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Yes," he replied, voice steady. "That's me." The officer gave a sharp nod. "Sir, we've been dispatched on direct orders from Admiral Nicholas T. Graves. He has requested that we assist with structural repairs to your home, specifically the heating system, roof, and front porch." Hank blinked. He looked at the convoy. More uniformed Navy personnel stood at the ready, some already opening equipment cases from the trucks. It was surreal, like a dream drifting in through the cold. "That's not necessary," he said, taking a step back. "I just did what anyone would have done." The officer's face didn't change, but his words carried a gravity that landed hard and gentle all at once. "With all due respect, sir," Admiral Graves was quite clear. His exact words were, "This man saved my life when he had no obligation to do so. The Navy takes care of its own, and anyone who helps one of ours becomes one of ours." Before Hank could say another word, the team moved, smooth, coordinated, precise. Electricians headed toward the basement. Engineers inspected the rooftop with scanners and tools Hank didn't recognize. Heating specialists rolled out insulated piping and boxes labeled with serial codes and warning tags. as a military operation. But this time, the mission was his house. One senior officer approached with a folder in hand. "Mr. Monroe," he said with measured respect, "we've reviewed your service record. Marine Corps Logistics, 1984 to 2004, honorable discharge and injury sustained during duty. Sir, 20 years of service speaks louder than words." Hank shifted awkwardly, rubbing his palms together. "Just a transport accident," he mumbled. "Nothing heroic." The officer didn't argue. He didn't need to. Admiral Graves also noted that you didn't mention your service background when you helped him. He had to look it up himself. That silenced Hank. He watched as, over the next hour, his quiet home became a hive of focused activity. Pipes were replaced, panels inspected, blueprints consulted, wiring analyzed. No one asked him for anything. They just did it. Across the street, more neighbors emerged, curious, bewildered, whispering to one another. On the second day, Mrs. Donovan appeared with a still warm apple pie wrapped in a towel. She handed it to Hank without ceremony. "Never knew we had a hero living across the street," she said with a sideways smile. "I'm no hero, ma'am," Hank replied, flustered. "Just did what any of those fellas would have done." She gave him a look that cut through excuses. "That's exactly what my Harold used to say. He was at Incheon, never thought he was special either." By the third day, neighborhood kids had gathered on the sidewalk to watch. A boy around 10 approached Hank, eyes wide. "Mr. Hank," he asked with awe, "are you like a secret agent or something?" Hank chuckled, kneeling. "Nah, son, just an old truck driver who gave someone a ride. But they're fixing your whole house." Hank paused, watching a pair of Navy engineers haul a brand new furnace into his basement. "Sometimes, Tommy," he said, "when you help someone without expecting anything in return, the world has a funny way of helping you right back." The boy nodded solemnly, as if hearing something important he'd remember forever. By the end of the third day, Hank's house no longer looked tired. The ancient furnace that had clunked and wheezed through decades of Pennsylvania winters had been replaced with a sleek, modern unit that hummed with quiet confidence. The electrical system, once a ticking time bomb of outdated wiring, now met every safety code in the book. The sagging roof, reinforced and sealed tight against wind and snow. But more than the repairs, it was what happened around the repairs that Hank couldn't quite explain. People talked to him now. Neighbors who had lived beside him for years suddenly saw him not just as the man with tools or the quiet guy in the truck, but as someone worth knowing. Mrs. Donovan came by again with extra pie. Mr. Patel from 2 doors down dropped off a thermos of chai and asked if Hank had ever been stationed near Okinawa. His cousin had served there too. Children gathered after school to peek at the Navy team's gear, whispering to each other like Hank was some kind of secret legend. At first, it made Hank uneasy. He wasn't used to attention. He wasn't built for it. He'd spent a lifetime moving through the world unnoticed, unbothered, but something about this sudden warmth, this quiet respect, felt different. It didn't demand anything of him. It just was. One afternoon near the end of the final inspection, Commander Richardson, ahead of the Navy construction team, walked Hank through the completed renovations. They moved slowly, room by room, like two men surveying the aftermath of a quiet battle. Every corner of the house now whispered safety, security, care. "This is," Hank began, but his throat caught. He cleared it. "It's more than I ever asked for." The commander smiled. "Admiral's orders, sir. However, between you and me, he made it clear this was personal, not official Navy business. He wanted to be here himself, but duty calls." He paused, then added, "South China Sea, the situation's shifting again." Hank nodded, understanding without needing to ask more. That's how service worked. The mission always came first. On the final day, as the trucks prepared to pull away and the team packed up the last of their equipment, the young officer who had first introduced himself returned, this time holding a wooden plaque. Handcrafted, polished, simple, etched into the surface, in bold, dignified lettering, "Veteran Shelter, honored by honor itself." He handed it to Hank gently. Admiral Graves commissioned this personally, the officer explained. Said it should be placed somewhere it'll catch the morning light. Hank ran his fingers along the carved letters. The wood was warm beneath his callous skin. Tell him, his voice faltered for a second. Tell him I'm grateful, but this wasn't necessary. The officer gave a knowing smile. He said you'd say exactly that. His response was, necessity has nothing to do with honor, Corporal Monroe. Hank didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, holding the plaque to his chest for a long moment. Later that evening, long after the jeeps had disappeared down the street and the neighborhood returned to its winter hush, Hank stood on his front porch, new railings beneath his hands, the bitter air softened by the quiet hum of a house, finally whole. He mounted the plaque beside his front door, just where the sun would strike it come morning. He looked out across the street. Mrs. Donovan stood there, arms crossed, watching again. Hank Monroe, she called out, hands on her hips. 30 years I've lived across from you, and not once did you mention you knew admirals. Hank chuckled, the sound low and genuine. I didn't, he said, not until 3 weeks ago. She narrowed her eyes playfully. And what exactly did you do, Hank? He paused, then answered simply, I picked up a man in a storm. It didn't matter who he was, just that he was freezing. Other neighbors had gathered by now, drawn by the story that was no longer a secret. Someone brought out folding chairs, someone else lit the fire pit, stories were shared. Hank found himself speaking, not in speeches, but in memories, in moments, in pieces of himself he hadn't given away in years. And for the first time in a long time, his house didn't just feel warm. It felt alive. It felt like home. The story of Hank Monroe spread quietly, like morning light creeping into a room. He never told it himself, he never had to. Word traveled in other ways, among neighbors, veterans, truckers, and through a few hushed conversations between people in uniform who still understood what it meant to serve without asking for credit. One morning, a thank you note appeared in Hank's mailbox. Then another. One was handwritten in neat cursive. From one who serves to one who remembers what service means. Another came with a small folded American flag, the kind given at funerals, left without a return address. At the local grocery store, men from the nearby VFW post began to greet him by name. He'd never stepped foot in the place before. Over the years, they'd invited him more than once. Come by, brother, they'd say, but he'd always declined. Too quiet, too tired, too detached. Now, the VFW commander came in person. We'd be honored to have you join us, he said. No pressure, just the kind of invitation that carried weight between soldiers. Hank nodded. He showed up to a meeting, then another, sat in the back, listened, said little, but something in him softened, not because he was being seen, but because maybe for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to be. He turned down every request for interviews. When the local paper called, he said no. When the county veterans office asked if he'd speak to students about duty and character, he declined again. I'm not good with speeches, he said, and the story's simple enough without me telling it. What Hank didn't know was that Admiral Graves had been watching. Not publicly, not with cameras or press releases, but through quiet channels, a word here, a check-in there. He followed the aftermath like a man tracking the ripple of a stone he'd thrown into a still lake. Then, one early March morning, a letter arrived in Hank's mailbox, thick envelope, Pentagon seal. In recognition of service above and beyond the call of duty, both in uniform and as a civilian, exemplifying the highest ideals of American citizenship. It invited him to Washington for a civilian commendation ceremony. Hank sat with the letter for 2 days. He didn't know what to do with it. He turned it over in his hands like something fragile. Finally, he called the number listed. I appreciate the honor, he said, but I'd prefer not to make a fuss. Please thank the Admiral for me. 2 days later, his phone rang. A familiar voice cut through the line. Firm, calm, unmistakable. Corporal Monroe, Admiral Graves said. Hank straightened unconsciously, even though no one could see him. Sir, I understand you declined our invitation. Yes, sir, I don't need recognition for doing what's right. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. You know, Monroe, in all my years, I've pinned medals on men who craved them and men who thought they didn't deserve them. But you're the first who's made me question what recognition even means. Hank didn't know how to respond, so he didn't. Would you permit a compromise? Graves continued. No Washington, no cameras, no speeches, just a small gathering at your local VFW, for the record, not for the headlines. Something in the Admiral's tone reached Hank in a place deeper than pride, something that felt like respect, not official, not ceremonial, but human. I could manage that, sir. Underscore, 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 it, underscore, 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 underscore. I, the VFW's annual spring recognition night was a modest affair. Folding chairs, flags on the wall, coffee in mismatched mugs. Hank wore a pressed shirt that still didn't feel quite right. He nursed a single beer in the corner, hoping to stay unnoticed. Then the room shifted. The air quieted. A man in a full dress uniform entered, rows of ribbons gleaming under the overhead lights. Two aides followed, but no one looked at them. All eyes were on him. Admiral Graves? He scanned the room, spotted Hank, and walked directly toward him. The veterans stepped aside, giving them space. Hank started to rise, but the Admiral lifted a hand. Stay seated, Corporal. He took the chair beside him. I've been meaning to thank you properly. No need, sir, Hank replied. You've done more than enough. The house alone. Graves shook his head slowly. That night, I lost signal, lost direction. You pulled me back from the cold. I just want to make sure you always stay warm enough. Hank smiled faintly, something flickering in his eyes. Just stopped for someone who needed help. Old reflex, I guess. The Admiral leaned forward, his voice softer now. That night you said you were just logistics. But there's no just in service, Corporal. You're the reason things move, the reason people eat, survive, and get rescued. Without logistics, even the finest battleship is just a floating metal shell. Hank let out a chuckle. You always this good with speeches? No, Graves said, but some men are worth the words. Later, in a brief ceremony attended only by fellow veterans, Admiral Graves stood before Hank and presented him with a medal. Not one is recorded in military archives, not listed in databases, but handcrafted, personal. His inscription read, "For reminding us what matters most." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was steady, genuine. And when it ended, the two men sat side by side in a silence they both understood, not bound by rank, but by something far stronger, the quiet honor of doing what's right, even when no one's watching. The ceremony ended quietly. There were no headlines, no cameras, no interviews waiting outside. A room of veterans who understood that real recognition wasn't meant to be loud, it was meant to be true. Later that night, Hank drove home. The road stretched dark and still ahead, but it no longer felt empty. The reflection of streetlights shimmered off his windshield as if the world itself was nodding in quiet approval. He parked, stepped out into the chilled air, and paused at the base of his front steps. The porch light flickered on, casting a soft glow across the plaque, now mounted beside the door. Veteran shelter honored by honor itself. He ran his fingers across it just once, then entered his house. It felt different now. Not just newer, not just warmer. It felt lived in, it felt seen. Over the following weeks, small things began to change. He didn't talk about them. He barely acknowledged them, but they happened, and they stayed. Someone left a folded flag on his doorstep. No note, just a quiet salute in cloth and color. Another day, a card arrived. To the man who helped someone who once helped us all. At the VFW, his name became something spoken with quiet pride. New members listened when he spoke, even if he said very little. They watched how he carried himself, how he held silence like it was sacred. At first, Hank tried to wave it off, but there was no denying the shift. Something in him, something he thought had been laid to rest years ago in the dust of forgotten highways and the ache of a healed but not healed knee, had come alive again. Not pride, not attention, connection. One afternoon, a high school teacher reached out on behalf of her civics class. She wanted Hank to come speak about service, about choices, about what it meant to act when no one else would. He almost said no, but then he thought of that night in the snow, of the way Graves had looked at him, not like a subordinate, not like a savior, but like an equal, a man who had simply done what was right when it mattered most. So he said yes. He didn't say much to the students, didn't give a lecture, just told them what happened, a man on the side of the road, a storm, a choice. And afterward, when a girl in the back raised her hand and asked, "Why'd you stop if you didn't know who he was?" Hank only smiled. It didn't matter who he was, he said, only that he was there, and alone. The class fell quiet, the kind of silence that stays with you. He didn't go looking for recognition after that, but it found him anyway. Haha. One morning, he opened his mailbox to find an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo, grainy, black and white. It showed a group of Marines in a desert, leaning against a supply truck. In the corner, a younger version of Hank stared straight at the camera. Behind the photo was a note, still carrying the mission, Semper Fi. He never figured out who sent it, but he didn't need to. The road ahead was still long, the work still tiring, but something had shifted, not in the world, but in Hank himself. And now, when he drove past long, frozen highways in the early dawn, he didn't just see snow and road signs. He saw moments when one choice could change everything. Moments when a quiet man, unseen for too long, stepped forward, not for glory, not for reward, but because something inside him still burned with duty. Because sometimes the world gives back, not with noise, but with grace.